I want to ask you, Kofi, about something that worried me when I was working in New York and still worries me a little, and I think I've never really put to you.
Yes.
And I want your view on. When at the UN, there were two main agendas.
Yes.
One was the first world, mainly security agenda.
Mm-hmm.
The other was the developing world, very strongly pro-poor development agenda.
Mm-hmm.
But in the middle, there was a whole swathe of countries, the middle-income countries, many of whom have now become the promoters of a new era, the emerging countries of a new era, that never had a place on the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Did we miss something there? Did you feel that we had left them out because they were resentful and angry and often blocked things on one agenda or the other?
Yeah.
Did we miss something there?
Thank you, Jeremy. That is it's a problem and a question I struggled with long before I became Secretary General, and you're absolutely right. When I became Director of the Budget, which entailed lots of negotiations with the powerful countries and the smaller countries, and of course the medium-income countries that you've referred to, the budget issue was very political. If you seek to increase the budget for human rights, in those days, many of the third world countries thought you were doing the bidding of the developed countries who are going to use the human rights arguments to whip them. And if you push for development on issues where some of the powerful countries were not ready, they accused you of doing the bidding of the smaller countries. And there was always a feeling in their mind that the UN was divided into two groups. Those who had the means and paid the bulk of the budget and wanted efficiency, effectiveness, and budgetary restraint. And those who didn't have the money, can't pay, and didn't pay, and were always pushing to spend more. And so the discussions on the budgetary and resources came through this. And this is why they eventually took a decision that the budgets must be approved by consensus. When that decision was taken, I was ahead of them, and I told the powerful country, particularly the US, that you are creating 189 vetoes. Because the way the consensus works at the UN is that we treat it as almost unanimity. A small group of countries can unreasonably withhold their consent and block everybody. And sure enough, the first country to hold up a budgetary approval was Libya. The ambassador put his veto down and vanished. So I had to chase him around, and we found him, and I said, "What is your problem?" He was upset about some treatment he had had, and he thought he was punishing the world, and particularly the West. So we had coffee in the delegates' lounge. After an hour or so, he said, "Well, you're an African brother. Because of the respect we have for you, we withdraw our objection. You don't do budgets that way." And of course, the middle countries often get frustrated, stuck in the middle. But because of this consensus group, what we have in the UN is bloc politics. I think it's something that is very familiar in Washington. So these middle-income countries that Sir Jeremy has referred to belong to a group of 77, which had most of the developing countries in it. So if they take a bloc decision, they are trapped. Now, of course, some of these countries in the middle income group are the emerging countries today. Brazil, India, Indonesia, and all of them. And of course, now they have a possibility to assert themselves. But they are going to find the same problems. They're going to find the same problems in the sense that the smaller and the weaker countries will remind them that it wasn't long ago when we were all outside the G8 and we used to complain that who are these self-appointed countries who come together once a year, take decisions which affect us without consulting us. I said, now you are part of the G20, but you must remember there are 172, 73 others who are outside the group and have the same feelings that you had towards the G8. And this is really the problem, one of the challenges we have with global governance. The smaller groups may be seen as more effective and efficient, but they are not representative and do not have the legitimacy of the larger universal organization. So I would hope that as we talk of reforming the organization, and the world is almost coming together in the sense that today not a single country claims not to govern by democracy, not to aspire to be a democracy. Not a single country is rejecting market forces or the economic model that countries have used to. So there is a coming together which I hope will remove the divide which existed in those days between the developing smaller countries and the big powerful countries.
This brings one question which I think is certainly on the minds of many here, and it's something that we do a lot of work on at Analytica for our clients, which is trying to understand where the US is in the world right now. There's a lot of talk of decline, about relative decline, about its use of its power, the economic crisis that it finds itself in. You were someone who went to the United States as a young man, you were educated in the US, you had and have great affection for the US, for American leadership, for American values in lots of ways, of course, as an African. When you see the US in the world today, what is it you see happening? What are the choices that the country is making, and does it concern you? Does it give you some sense that it might find its way out, or are we in a world that really is changing and will therefore permanently change the influence of the UN, the US, both at the UN, but also more broadly?
Yeah, I think the world has changed, and the world is changing. The US has had a unique position in the world, incredible influence and power. Those days are gone, in the sense that whilst one respects the power and influence of the US, there are other forces around. I never accepted the concept that we ever lived in a unipolar world. I accepted that the US was the most powerful country in the world. But even during those days, when we heard a lot about unipower, I knew that Russia saw Moscow as a power. China saw itself as a power. India did not diminish its own influence. So there were other forces at work. And also the sense that you are the only elephant in the room sometimes gets you into trouble, because you behave in a manner that you wouldn't if you felt there were other elephants that would check you. And in fact, already the US attitude globally has changed. I mean, the way US talk to China today is quite different. You have to give your banker some respect. They don't handle it the same. And I believe the US is going to have influence over a long time, but it has to be a collaborative effort. It has to be an attempt that brings in the emerging countries, that one cooperates fully with them. It has to be a country that respects the ideals and the values that it preaches. It has to be a country in the Middle East, for example, where they will have to help promote or respect democracy, human rights. And the old days where he's a dictator, but our dictator is fine, those days are gone. And also we are seeing the movements amongst people. And here you cannot support autocratic or unpopular leaders. And we have also seen what is happening around the world, which for me says that if leaders fail to lead, the people can make them follow. If leaders fail to lead, the people can make them follow. We've seen this in India with Anna Hazare, bringing the people to the streets. It forced the government to take action on corruption. They failed to lead, and the people pushed them to do it. We are seeing similar phenomena in the Middle East and North Africa. And I think if leaders do not lead and stay ahead of the curve, they're going to have problems. And I can also assure you, good leaders are good followers. So I wouldn't be surprised if it happened.
Rana Mitter from the University of Oxford. Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your extremely thought-provoking comments. If I may, I'd like to slightly take issue with something you just said in the last part of your conversation about the role of democracy. It strikes about democracy because you made this strong and powerful statement that democracy and universal human rights are universal values. The power in the world which seems to be rising very successfully and has a huge role at the UN is China. China continues to maintain a single-party dictatorship, at least at the national level, and it does say that human rights, while it understands the term, are relative, certainly in terms of the current use of civil rights. Would it be right to read your comments at the podium as a veiled criticism of China?
My comments apply across the board. China may not be in the situation today to do what I think should be done or the changes that we are seeing elsewhere. But in the long term, China is going to face the same challenges. A man cannot live by bread alone. China, through high growth, is able to satisfy the needs of its people. And this growth may continue for a long time. If in a decade or two that growth were to stop, and you have mass demonstrations, upheavals, and all that, what happens? I mean, we have had this debate in the West, and I was one of those who was very unhappy with some of the changes and the shortcuts that some Western governments were seeking as a fight against terrorism. In effect, they were asking the people to give up some of their rights, their civil liberties, to be protected against terrorists. And the question I asked at the time is, if you are asked to give up your civil liberties and rights and human rights to be protected, and you do, are you in the end protected? In my mind, the answer is very clear. And this also goes to the Chinese situation that you've raised. Over the long term, they're going to confront the same thing. And the people's answer will be similar to the answer I'm giving to this issue.